Welcome to the Retail Smarts podcast. I'm Dominique Lamb, the CEO of the National Retail Association, and today we're incredibly proud to be speaking to Mary Aldred, who's the CEO of the Franchise Council Australia. Welcome, Mary. It's so great to have you on our show and certainly to talk to you about all things franchise and industry body and just simply everything that's happening, I think, at the moment. We've been very, very grateful to work alongside you throughout this entire what seems like the never-ending COVID-19 period. I know we kept talking about, when COVID started and COVID still hasn't ended, and here we are. But it's been wonderful working with you. And for all of our listeners, Mary and I and other associations have been advocating on behalf of businesses across the country around all things COVID-19, whether it be leasing and tenancy to stimulus packages, and now, of course, vaccine passports. So, Mary, how did you come to work at the Franchise Council?
Well, I have a little bit of an unorthodox kind of approach into industry groups. I left school at 15, worked in my parents' small business, appreciated how tough that really is running a small business. And so from there went to work in government as an advisor and then into the Energy Supply Association, which is now the Australian Energy Council. And I just really understood how important industry groups can be to their member businesses, being able to, stick your head up where individual businesses might not be able to on different issues. And I think, just reflecting on how closely we've been able to work over these last 18 months, there's that saying, success has many parents. And I think what we've been able to do, FCA and NRA and the other industry groups we've worked with, I think that's been a real strength to our arm, and the benefit really has been there collectively for our member businesses in working together on some of the issues that you've just listed.
It's certainly been like screaming into a storm on many days. And, I think that, you would have experienced this. I mean, how do you manage having a large membership base with a myriad of problems that, in your space range from anything from kind of fitness to food to traditional retail to, even different forms of franchise with banner groups and all sorts of other complex matters? I mean, how do you prioritise all the things that your membership raise with you?
It's a great point, and I often think, industry groups are not businesses, but they should be run in a business-like manner. So it's looking at being able to prioritise really critical issues, especially around, as we've seen through this period, business sustainability, business continuity, literally discussions around entire business sectors getting shut down overnight because they're not included in a list of permitted businesses. So being able to prioritise very clearly those issues. And as you say, franchising, I like to say, from hamburgers to hairdressing and finance to fitness. So lots of different industry sectors, but lots of different models of franchise businesses just within that sector as well. So that's been quite challenging at times. And I think that's where more so than ever before, just that capacity to bring other organisations together to work with you and the NRA, particularly on those shared areas of common interest, to be able to really vocalise strongly to government with one united voice. The absolute benefit has been there for our member businesses, and I think the proof's in the pudding and what we've been able to achieve with some really good outcomes through that time together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's still tough, right? We're right now, we're obviously working on watching New South Wales start to open up, and I think we're all waiting to see if the new Premier is going to follow through and really, open them up on Friday as he's promised. Certainly the department's pushing back on that. I mean, for your members, how hard has this period been? I mean, obviously the verticals have different, levels of difficulty, and some people have done really well, but, what do you think the future looks like in terms of franchising in Australia?
Yeah, very different to, I think, 10 years ago, very different to even 2 years ago. I think at a business level, we've got, people that have qualified in a particular vocation and worked in aviation or tourism, and that's not going to come back as exactly as it was before. And so we're getting a lot of interest from people that are saying, look, I'd be really interested in running my own small business, taking charge of my own financial security, my own hours. So they're looking at things like mobile dog washers or or retail businesses. That coupled, I think, with population and demographic changes. So we're getting quite a big shift out of CBD areas. Regional areas are really booming, and that with it brings new opportunities. So I think we're seeing a shift there. And also COVID has treated different businesses in different ways, right? So if you're in freight logistics, that's gone absolutely gangbusters in a lot of ways. But if you're in hospitality, other parts of retail, that has been a really, really tough journey over the last year and a half or so. And so for us, being able to work with member businesses that home handyman services, I've seen be able to pivot through lockdown to be able to go and work with some of your member businesses in, installing Perspex glass behind counters to protect staff, or working with Bunnings to do home deliveries. But not everybody, like our fitness members, not everybody can pivot to, say, an online class or a takeaway coffee. And so they're the businesses that we've had to work particularly closely with and make sure that those messages on the ground are getting through to government ministers. And if I have, say, around 400 member businesses, that's great. But teaming up with you and maximising the number of members that we're speaking on behalf of collectively, I think has been even more powerful in getting those messages across.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's definitely no doubt that I think forming, a coalition, has been incredibly beneficial, certainly for our membership as well, because I think with that storm element, where there are just so many people that have need, and there are so many people trying to get the attention of government, and whether it's via the media or whether it's internally, politically, amongst other things, I think that, having that strength in numbers has been incredibly important, but also having, different perspectives, because it's almost as if, you have to prove that if you're saying something and somebody else is saying it, it's got more validity in kind of a space like this. I mean, I think naturally we tend to be, and it might sound a little bit cliched, but as female leaders, we typically do tend to be more collaborative as opposed to competitive in this space. I mean, what's your experience been like, I think, as a female CEO, in the land of associations where there, are very few of us?
Absolutely. I think, women are particularly collaborative in that space, and there's some other terrific, female CEOs and leaders in other industry sectors that provide some great models. And I always think you can talk a big game publicly and champion equality and making sure diversity is represented, but what actually counts is not a platitude around that in isolation, but how you walk that walk in your day job and in everything that you do every day, how you treat people, the values that you live by. And so I think, doing that with respect and purpose is what really counts. And it's been, I think also industry groups, it's not like a Bunnings versus Masters or a David Jones versus Myer, where we're not in isolation, competitive commercial businesses. We do actually need to be able to collaborate on areas of common purpose, like commercial leasing arrangements. I mean, it's been fantastic to be able to work with you on firstly getting up the National Leasing Code of Conduct in 2020, and then being able to get those codes re-established in Victoria and New South Wales. I'm pretty sure we couldn't have done that by ourselves, but working with you and Theo at the ACA and other industry groups, that's been just fantastic to have that united way of going about our work. So I think, doing things cohesively, doing things with purpose in a collective sense, but also living the values that you talk about every day is what really matters.
It's interesting, because I think that journey, for our listeners, particularly when you think about like the leasing code, when that was initially worked on, I mean, we had the Shopping Centre Council Australia in that. And of course, there's no way that we're going to agree with them, on all things. And I think that through this process, we've certainly all learnt, almost a healthier way to interact with each other, because we've all had to get a collective job done for the good of the ecosystem, which I think we all now accept is kind of everyone, because we've all taken so many knocks through this period. You talk a lot about, values and walking those values. I mean, who are some of the mentors that you've had, throughout your career that have kind of instilled that in you?
think it goes back to your point earlier just around female leaders. And I guess my response to that is there's some tremendous male leaders as well, but they are the ones that actually walk that talk in how they go about their work. And so I started out in the Energy Supply Association when Brad Page was the CEO there. And I was in a very junior role, but I looked at the way he went about his role, and I thought, wow, if I ever got the opportunity to lead an industry group, that is how I would do it. The absolute bone deep connection with your members, being able to understand all of the issues that they're dealing with, understanding that every day our member businesses get out of bed, they have to do really well at what they do as a business to be able to justify that value proposition. It is not just something frivolous that we should take for granted. So I think, Brad was a really great mentor and leader in that sense. I think Ines Willocks at AIG is someone that I've followed for a long time. And I think, again, taking that bigger picture sense of purpose, bringing people along on a shared vision and being able to enable others in your team to go out with a common purpose have been some of the things that have really resonated with me.
It's interesting. I worked for Ines. So I came from Australian Industry Group before I eventually ended up at the National Retail Association. And he has very reverent power about him. And I think the most exciting thing about him as a leader is just how informed he is. So he's very much, in touch with that detail. He speaks for an incredibly broad membership group because I think, they would be close to the largest, if not the largest, in comparison to ACCI in Australia. So they represent a lot of people, but he's very considered in his approach. And, we've been lucky enough to do a lot of industrial work alongside Australian Industry Group. And, I think you're absolutely right about getting on with it, I think. And, having a very kind of calm and reasonable leadership style, it really does go a long way.
And I think that if I can just add on that, Ines is very comfortable and reasonable in the positions that he takes. So he doesn't feel the need to be out in the media, every single day on every issue. It's a very deliberate stance that he seems to take on positions of public policy interest to his members. And I think that's worth noting as well.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I think, it's funny because obviously, as you say, associations are for their members and they operate and they are in existence for the benefit of their members. And I think, certainly here at the NRA, we do ask ourselves, what would our members think? What would our members want? What do our members need? And that's kind of where we come back to as a baseline every day, because at the end of the day, you've really got to work for your members. But I think, and you would see this, it's broader than that too. It comes down to kind of industry as well. And as I said, that ecosystem. I mean, do you find managing that kind of membership and industry, because franchise is so diverse, difficult to tackle sometimes?
It's a great question because, and I'll answer it in two parts. Franchising, I'm a new entrant into. So I had worked in retail as a younger person, but not in a deep sort of franchise sense. And so coming in 3 years ago, I was on a very steep learning curve, especially with the parliamentary inquiry, which I think was announced 2 weeks before I started. So that was a baptism of fire. But what I noticed also was franchising is a really close-knit community. Other small businesses will ring up other small businesses and say, "Hey, I'm grappling with this issue. How would you deal with this?" And there's a really strong sense of support in that community. But the first part of your question around that ecosystem is, I think, very much at play in industry groups at a national level like an AIG or at a local level. I got to have the opportunity to start with the Committee for Gippsland, which was a new initiative for the region where it was about bringing all these different organisations together. And I've got to say, in the early days as a startup, sometimes just getting a sign painted or a phone line connected, you can chalk up to an achievement. But one of the things I really learnt out of that, in addition to, the absolute critical necessity of clarity of purpose, and as you say, what do your members expect, is also around relationships and contact. So I started in that role, over 10 years ago, so 2011, and I built some great relationships. And one of the the relationships out of that was with Jarla Pulford, because she's a Victorian government minister who had agriculture and regional development. So we had a lot to do with each other in that role. And now, of course, she's small business minister. And so sometimes it swings and roundabouts. And I think, being able to build a rapport with people that's based on trust, on a candidness. So where, I'm not always going to agree with the Victorian government's position on things, and certainly have had some pretty strong takes against the way things have been handled in different ways over the last 18 months. But that has been a really important relationship in terms of where I'm sitting now, because I can take issues to the minister in a candid and frank way. And, there's lots of other connections that you make along the way. And people will keep coming back to you as a trusted source of advice, I hope, if you treat them with respect and honesty, and again, live by those values that you talk about.
Absolutely. And, you've mentioned the regions and obviously Gippsland. I mean, I think the region, you're quite passionate about the regions. I mean, where does that come from? Were you raised in the country? Where does your love for Australian regions come from?
Yeah, so I grew up in a little town called Upper Beaconsfield, which was sort of the gateway to Gippsland a while back. But I think, I'm really passionate about regions for a number of reasons. In terms of Gippsland, I'm proud to come from a region, I like to say, that grows, makes, milks and manufactures things. We export things. We make things. That's where our food comes from, our furniture, our quality of life, our electricity, our water. And it's really important that it shouldn't be a city-country divide, but it is really important that across Australia, we do have an appreciation and an understanding about how those things are made, and how lucky we are to be able to access them so readily. And I think particularly when we're talking about resources, timber workers, where we have a very high standard of doing things on a timber board in Gippsland. You never want a referendum or a moratorium on regional jobs just decided in city communities. And so I think it's so important to have an open, honest, informed conversation around the social licence of continuing to make and grow and process those products and services, and that we do understand each other. So I am very passionate about regional communities.
But quite rightly, I mean, we've certainly seen throughout this pandemic, and you've met our friends, the Snow Industry Association, and obviously it's quite shocking what they're dealing with in the sense that we're talking tens of thousands of regional jobs just simply because they're a subset of retail that nobody's considered or has a unique experience. And I think that what people fail to realise, as you say, when decisions are made about jobs in cities for regional communities, is that you can do serious long-term damage to a location if you basically force its inhabitants to leave. I mean, it's not just about the fact that, we're not, milking and making and doing those things anymore because there aren't any jobs, but the creation of, no first-time jobs for kids because there's no retail, because, we don't have the foot traffic for a main street, or because we've got high levels of crime because there isn't anything for kids to do. It's becoming such a significant issue, I think, across the country. And while it's good to see, I think, people moving out of those major cities and moving into regions because now we've got this kind of work-life balance and everyone's used to Zoom is one thing. But I think there needs to be some real investment in those spaces, not just, so we can open more retail stores, of course, but just simply because, these are communities and they're living and breathing. And if we don't see that investment and activation, then they die,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I imagine you see that in Gippsland. I mean, I'm sure there's been times where it's kind of ebbed and flowed, right? And it's about kind of making those ebbs and flows less. Because I think, right now, they're either doing really well or they've been forgotten, and that's really tough to watch.
It is. And I love to say, your postcode shouldn't determine your potential in life. And so that's why it's really important for education. Infrastructure is a primary enabler of productivity and opportunity for people to be able to access work and study and all of those sort of things. I think there's also, when we're talking about ecosystems, such an important relationship between that large quantum of heavy industry and employment in regions like timber mills, or, you know, we've got your Lawn Power Station in Gippsland that's going through a transition. That alone is so important. We did a study at Committee for Gippsland a couple of years ago, just with one power station in a region that contracted about 250 small business services. So you think the local newsagent, that they would buy $5,000 or thereabout of newspapers, the dry cleaners, the local sandwich shop for catering. And so all of those sort of things are very dependent on being able to attract and maintain significant investment in regional areas. And so whether it's Energy Australia or Federation University, Borough Foods, Paddy's Foods in East Gippsland that make 4 and 20 pies, all of those businesses are very, very important to how the rest of the community is able to travel and the quality of life that people in this region are able to maintain.
Let's pivot back to franchising for just a second. You know, that Senate inquiry was really hard on your members. And I think before that, what was really even harder was probably the introduction of the Vulnerable Workers Act. Do you see Australia attracting more franchise businesses, you know, in the future? Do you think people will still want to come here given how difficult our regulation is, you know, not only at a federal level, but now obviously at a state level? And I guess just the world watching what's happening in Australia at the moment, because we were the darlings of COVID and obviously we're not right now. I mean, how do you see that playing out in terms of getting more franchise opportunities for mums and dads to buy into?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I think a couple of parts to it. So, I mean, I'm still talking to international investors that are actively looking at Australia, you know, where we have great proximity to Southeast Asia, skilled and available workforce, fantastic quality of life, all of the things. But we've got some really big challenges to make sure that investment continues. So part of that's small business. You know, I think about 44% of the Australian workforce are employed in a small business, and out of COVID, small business is going to be such a critical vehicle on that pathway to economic recovery for people. So we've got to continue to drive that. I do worry that in Australia, our national conversation around issues and problems that arise automatically pivots to more red tape, more regulation as our first answer, which is not always an improvement on where things are at. Australia's probably got the most highly regulated franchising jurisdiction anywhere in the world. And yet, as we saw through that parliamentary inquiry, also a high level of complaints at the time around behaviour and compliance. So you can't automatically say, well, just introducing more regulation is going to fix everything. What I learned out of that inquiry was that, you know, there were significant issues that we had to address as a sector and listen very carefully. Also, that there's two sides to a story, and that not every story and example is exactly the same. So some were, you know, very devastating stories. Others had another side to that story which wasn't told. As an industry organisation, we have reformed significantly so that, to my earlier point around not more regulation is always the answer, we now have a really comprehensive, you know, training and education platform that, if you're looking at franchising as a sector, it can be fantastic, but due diligence is absolutely key, as with any business that you'd look at entering into. So asking not just what are the upfront capital costs, but what are the ongoing costs of that running that business? Do you like dealing with customers? How comfortable are you managing staff? If you're looking at buying a bike shop, are you actually interested in cycling? What are the other third-party contracts that you might be entering into on commercial leasing, for example, suppliers, those sort of things? So making sure that you get expert advice, legal and financial advice at the outset is something we've been really strong on. But I also think just working with our members at an industry-led level to provide some solutions to the very genuine issues that were posed through that inquiry has seen us, I think, streets ahead from where we started.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and certainly I think, you know, there was a lot of noise around that Senate inquiry, and there was a lot of damage to, you know, a whole myriad of brands. And I think, as you've said, you know, there are two sides in many of cases, and you guys have certainly been incredibly strong advocates about how do you pick a franchise, how do you decide if, you know, going into small business is right for you? Because I think, you know, it's a bit like that tree change or that seed change. people think, I know what I'll do. I'll get out of, a big corporate business and I'll buy a cafe, not realizing that means they actually have to work in the cafe and that they might not actually like people. So, I really enjoyed some of those tips because that's where I was headed. I was like, Mary, what are your top tips for franchise? But you covered it anyway.
It's so true though, because the number of people you would see the same stories. I want to buy a cafe, but I don't want to work on Saturdays. I want to play golf on Saturdays. Well, Saturdays might be your busiest trading period, and that's fine if you don't want to work Saturdays, but you're going to have to resource your time out of that business by paying, someone to man the cafe and serve customers. And so that's going to, impact on the overall profitability. And they're the things that people don't always work through at the outset.
And I think, for us, the one thing we're really big about it at the NRA is this financial literacy concept. And even though I think, very worldly, well-read human beings decide to buy a cafe franchise, some of them don't realise how many cups of coffee it takes to pay their rent or pay a worker or even know where to look for what the right modern award is, amongst other things. So, it is quite a complex decision to make. And I think, as an industry, we're very lucky that there's somewhere like you to go to at the Franchise Council just to look at all those things and to look at the kinds of support that's available and to make sure you're making all of the right decisions, or at least, prompting your members to make sure that they're picking the right franchisees as well.
That's so important. But, sometimes something will hit you out of left field and someone will raise an issue with you that you go, I haven't come across that one before. And that's when I get on the phone to you and say, hey, Dom, have you come across this issue? And that, again, is why it's so great to have that collaborative working relationship between our organisations, I think.
And I think, as an industry, that should be encouraged because you can't be everywhere at once. I mean, at the end of the day, and I think in times like this where it's almost like having landmines just go off, in various parts of the country, if you're focused heavily on one side and you're not looking to the others, sometimes you need eyes and ears in other places to make sure that your members don't miss anything as well. And, and certainly we've really enjoyed our partnership with you and certainly the Franchise Council. And certainly our members, I think, are very supportive of us working, with as many associations as we can to make sure we get it right. Because I think it's just complex. I mean, you would see it right now. I mean, what do you think this is the hardest it's been, the New South Wales, Victorian ACT lockdown, or do you think we're set to see harder? I'd hope not, but...
Oh, gosh, I hope not too. I think... last year was really tough, but it was like being hit by a big wave. There was that shock and awe factor to it. And even though, we'd had some tough times, people generally had financial reserves to get them through. I think this year's been tougher than last year because, I like to say people are just running out of financial and mental reserves. They're running, they didn't have a profitable year last year in most cases. So they're really, really running low financially, but also emotionally. The toll that now, getting on to 2 years nearly in February, that is taking on people has just been astronomical. So I think we're going to see, a lot of significant changes in the way people do business. CBDs are, I think particularly for Melbourne that's had the number and the longevity of lockdown. If you're a little coffee retail business at the base of one of those big commercial buildings that might be paying $100,000 a year in rent, you're not going to have the same level of foot traffic coming back. So people come back to the office, but they might come back 3 days a week. We're doing some work with Bernard Salt at the moment, who just does great work around demographics and sea change, tree change, all of those things that we can glean some insight into as far as projected consumer behaviour, shopping behaviour, that businesses can hopefully then make some informed investment and planning decisions off the back of. But it's really difficult because none of us have a crystal ball at the end of the day to be able to get that absolute certainty, which is what businesses want. My members are saying to me, I just want the government to say, if we're going to open on this date, they are going to follow through with that, and we can plan ahead. But it's a shifting of the goalpost that's just wearing people down.
as you mentioned, that kind of mental resilience being lower last time. I mean, I know certainly for our members, that desperation element has kicked into a whole other gear with New South Wales being in lockdown for this long. How do you as a leader, manage the weight of that? Because, I know like myself and certainly our team at the moment, it's 24/7. It's 7 days a week. It's very hard to take leave and the stories are getting worse. How do you look after yourself and your team at a time like this?
It's a really, really good point. And I think, we're responsible for the well-being of our teams as well. I've got a pretty small team and everybody is just working as hard as they can, trying to do everything they can, whether it's looking after our events through to our member comms to help our members get through. I think a couple of things, like this morning, we actually had a webinar we've got a number of fitness brands. So we've been doing these webinars about once a month, just with a different franchisee from a fitness brand, taking us through. It might be Pilates at home, might be a workout at home, just to do something different. We've been doing a couple of, I know people are over Zoom and drinks, but a couple of different types of webinars. So we had John McTiernan, who was Tony Blair's advisor, dial in from the UK just to talk about what that was like. So changing things up a little bit, but on a day-to-day level, making sure that you stick to a routine. So I like taking my dog for a walk in the morning, trying to get out, cycling a little bit, reading listening to podcasts on some totally unrelated matter to get your mind away from it. And I do think you need to be able to compartmentalise different issues at different times. Otherwise, we're both very passionate, I know, about doing everything we can to help our member businesses. But to be able to do that, I think you've got to be able to compartmentalise things.
So what is your poison when it comes to podcasts? This is getting personal. But really, what are you listening to?
Oh, look, I must say murder podcast and true crime has been, about the only thing worse than some of the, terrible situations that some of our members have had to face through COVID. So that's been totally different and a bit off the wall, but just something else to get into. I am an avid equestrian fan, so I loved the Olympics a couple of months ago. Great to see Andrew Hoy, in his 60s, winning gold medals still. My friend Emma Booth was in the Paralympics. So proud that, she came 5th or 6th in her dressage test. And so I love, being able to watch some international show jumping to get away from it.
Fantastic. And where do you watch international show jumping when the Olympics isn't on? I'm just curious. Do you use like a YouTube thing or?
Yeah, there's heaps of YouTubes actually. If you don't have like KO, the sports streaming channel, YouTube can just, if you type in, show jumping or even eventing, badminton, Hickstead, show jumping, that can be just a great series of 15-minute videos to watch. It's a good thing to get your mind in a different space.
Fantastic. It's funny because our office, a lot of our directors also listen to true crime podcasts as well. So it must be a way of reminding ourselves that things can be worse than some of the days we've been having at the moment. But for me, I listen to RuPaul. I just love his insights into life. And he has this podcast with Michelle Visage, and they interview the most interesting people across the world about all sorts of things. So I've been kind of in that rabbit hole for some time, and periodically, pop in and out of a few other things. I was listening to, when we could travel a few months ago on a domestic flight, I was listening to a true crime podcast about, it was actually made into a documentary on the ABC about the last Indigenous tracker.
Oh, wow.
They found a little girl in South Australia after 3 days who went missing on a farm. And it was one of the most interesting podcasts I've heard in a very, very long time. And it's a whole documentary, to the point that even in the reenactments, they got his great-great-grandson to come and play him. And the woman's still alive. And it was the first time, I think at 90-something, she had spoken about her experience. And she formed a spiritual connection with this tracker because he said he could feel her in the elements and he knew where she was. And she wasn't afraid because she was so used to all of the noises that he actually followed her via all the elements and then found her, and they maintained this connection for the period of his life and hers. And he was paid by the South Australian Police, which was quite rare, and it was a really minor payment, but this guy was doing the most incredible work and found lots of people in this space. Anyway, so that's my top tip for podcasts. But I think that's probably all that we have time for today. And I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you better because we spent a lot of time on consultation.
We do.
Talking about all these
QR codes.
But I never get to talk about all of the other things that I guess make you. So it's been really lovely. So thank you so much for coming on our podcast today. And, we look forward to working with you through all of this chaos and a time when we can actually travel and hopefully see each other in person at some point.
Absolutely. I'll be able to tell you all about the Hawthorn Football Club next time.
That's it. That's exactly it.
No, it's been great, Dom. And I really appreciate being able to work with you. I think the success that we've been able to have on behalf of our members over the last, as hard as it has been, those things that we've been able to, the little wins and the things we've been able to get over the line, from my perspective, have been because we've been working with you in that shared purpose and maximised ability to influence and talk to decision makers. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Take care.